Yeah, our heads are cut off in this picture.
Okay, Rabbi, you are up.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the annual Rabbi Alexander M. Shapiro Memorial Lecture. In a different year, this would have been the Memorial Breakfast and Lecture. And unfortunately, the pandemic has made it impossible for us to gather in person. But with full hearts, we gather here this morning to pay tribute to Rabbi Shapiro, Oheb Shalom, in the most poignant and important way that we can, which is to gather together to study, to learn, to connect to our tradition, and to connect to one another. Those are values that Rabbi Shapiro embraced wholeheartedly and with great passion, and we do so here today in keeping with our annual tradition of remembering our beloved rabbi who served Oheb Shalom congregation from 1972 until his very untimely passing in 1992. Before we continue, I want to offer thanks to Jeremy Garber and the members of the LLL team for all of the work they are doing this year to continue Oheb Shalom's tradition of learning and study together. There are quite a number of opportunities to learn and study, and I thank Jeremy and the team for all of the work, seen and unseen, that makes it possible for us to continue to learn together. I have the privilege and opportunity to offer a few opening words. I do this b'shem omro, which is a common Jewish practice. I say these words in memory of, having heard them from my own teacher, and I share with you that in yesterday's Parashat Vayera, the disturbing and bewildering episode of the Akedah is told. And there, a somewhat unnoticed aspect of the story that lives in the shadow of the larger narrative of Abraham's attempted sacrifice of Isaac, a lesser known element of the story and a bit unnoticed, is that at the end of this harrowing episode, Abraham and Isaac apparently depart Mount Moriah, Har HaMoriah, separately. We infer this from the text where it simply tells us that Abraham left and went to Be'er Sheva, and a reasonable reading of the story would lead us to say that Abraham left by himself and Isaac must have left by himself as well. We can all imagine perhaps where he went, what his state of mind was. Perhaps he went running off. Perhaps he couldn't speak to his father. All kinds of ideas are possible. But in general, we might look at that story and say, they seem to be divided. There seems to be a wide and broadening gap between them. That's an idea that has some resonance in our own nation today. The notion of not only divided government, but the notion of divided electorate. And that's something I think most reasonable people would say, while partisanship may have its virtues and benefits, it is what the founding fathers intended. On the other hand, it so often leads to acrimonious, bitter confrontation. And so a divided nation, a divided electorate is not always or necessarily preferred or beneficial to us. Back to the story of Abraham and Isaac, the commentators across the centuries pick up on this idea that Abraham and Isaac were separated or divided from each other in the aftermath of the Akedah, this episode that we call the binding of Isaac. And so they comment, where did he go? What did he do? One commentary says he went somewhere to heal. That is, while the story doesn't give us precise information, it suggests to us that when Abraham lifts the ma'achelet, the machete virtually to kill his son in response to a perceived divine command, the knife actually touched his skin and punctured the skin and began to make a cut in his skin. And therefore, Isaac needed to heal. Another commentary tells us that Isaac went to a Bet Midrash to study, that he made himself whole emotionally through study. And either way, the trajectory of the story shares with us that in time to come, Isaac had become whole in some ways. He was able to reunite with his brother Ishmael, and they were both able to come to bury Abraham together when Abraham's life came to an end. So that act of physical healing and the act of spiritual healing through his study brought him to a place where he could overcome the partisanship, the divide that seemed to exist between himself and other members of his family. I offer these words today, not only as an insight into what our own nation needs, healing and learning from one another, learning about one another, learning and listening. But I offer them also as a symbolic description of what the rabbinate of Rabbi Alexander Shapiro was about. It was about healing. It was about making people whole in the truest sense of the word. In so many ways, pastorally, religiously, humanly, Rabbi Shapiro devoted himself to enabling people to become whole. And that really is what healing is, to become whole as a person. And he devoted himself unquestionably to the Jewish pursuit of learning. And as we read the words of Torah from this past week's parasha and contemplate the events of our nation, let's do so today in thoughtful tribute to Rabbi Shapiro, who in his own life and rabbinate and in his enduring rabbinate at Oheb Shalom remind us that a divided people, a divided nation, a divided family can seek wholeness through healing, through study, through learning. And it is to those eternal pursuits that we devote ourselves. And we do so in his memory.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm now going to, I'm Jeremy Garber, chair of the Lifelong Learning Committee, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce our teacher this morning, our Rabbi Elie Kaunfer. Rabbi Kaunfer is president and CEO of the Hadar Institute, an Upper West Side institute that encourages Jews to dig deeper into study and prayer. And I saw something on the internet that the Hadar Institute is even training rabbis. I don't know if it's true. So it's also it's going to bring a new generation of rabbis. Rabbi Kaunfer has previously worked as a journalist, banker, and corporate fraud investigator. A graduate of Harvard College, he completed his doctorate in liturgy at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was also ordained. A Wexner Graduate Fellow and Dorot Fellow, he's co-founder of the related minyan to Hadar Institute, Kehilat Hadar, and has been named multiple times to Newsweek's list of the top 50 rabbis in America. His 2010 book, Empowered Judaism, What Independent Minyanim Can Teach Us About Building Vibrant Jewish Communities, I'm sure is going to inform his lesson and teaching this morning. And one further thing, I would like to thank the extended Shapiro family for showing up. We're so sorry this can't be in person, but we're so glad that you're here by Zoom. And also thanking Betty Feinberg, who she and her husband Sheldon Feinberg for decades have been staunch supporters of the Shapiro commemoration. So thank you, Betty Feinberg. And without further ado, Rabbi Kaunfer.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to honor the memory of Rabbi Shapiro with you this morning. One day we'll be together in person, but in the meantime, we're gonna learn together on Zoom. If you're interested in more about Hadar, thank you for the lovely introduction. Just putting that into the chat. If you wanna tool around our website, there's a ton of opportunities to learn online with us, and invite you to connect as you wish. So today we're going to explore the question of what does it mean to say the words of prayer and really believe them? Or to put it another way, if I don't connect to the words of the traditional prayer book, what am I supposed to do? What are my options? And how might we explore that in a sophisticated way? So we're going to look at a specific prayer that you're probably familiar with if you've ever been to synagogue. And we'll use that as a case study to try to open up some options about what it means to pray with a full heart, and to understand also how the Siddur was written. Like, what's the style of the Siddur and how does it work? Because ironically, Jews are really good at getting together to recite the words of the Siddur, but not often studying the words of the Siddur, and that's what we're going to have the opportunity to do today. There'll be some opportunities also for you to jump in to ask questions throughout. And so I'm going to invite you to do that at the moments that comes. You can also always feel free to put a question in the chat. Jeremy's going to help handle those as well. So to start off, I'm going to take us to back in time, 1952, a conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey, not too far away. There were 187 rabbis at this conference. And the question at the conference was, what are we supposed to do with prayer in the suburban conservative synagogue, which doesn't seem to be working that well? Okay, this is in the early 1950s. That was the theme of the conference. And there were two main speakers who were addressing the challenge and the question. And I'm going to share my screen and show you some of the sources that we're going to work through today. If you also like to sort of toggle around and look at the source sheet on your own, Justin can drop that into the chat, the Google Doc version of it. But I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along. And we're going to look at two responses to how might we fix prayer in the suburban conservative synagogue. I'm going to share the screen right now. Hopefully you can see that. So the first solution comes from a rabbi named Eugene Cohn. He was the keynote speaker on the first night of the conference. And this is what he said. He said the traditional rituals must be studied as artistic forms of religious expression, which in every age need to be re-examined from the point of view of their truth and their relevance to the spiritual needs and interests of the times. Whatever is merely archaic and no longer awakens religious thought and emotion, even in those who are familiar with the traditional meaning, must be discarded. Okay, so what Rabbi Cohn was saying here is that if you don't like the words of the prayer book, then you should toss them, right? You should take your red pen and cross them out, discard them, because they're not actually awakening religious thought and emotion. Now, he put this theory to practice because he was, along with Mordechai Kaplan, his more famous collaborator, the two of them published the first Reconstructionist Siddur in 1945. So this is only a few years later, where he is sort of reflecting on the process of, we did this, we went through the Siddur, we cut out everything we didn't like, we came up with a new Siddur, and now our prayer life is better. Okay, so here the idea is, you don't like the words of prayer, you cut them off. Cut them out, and whatever's left, that's what you can daven with. Okay, and that is indeed a totally reliable and I would say at this point venerable Jewish approach to praying. Pioneered by the Reform movement in 19th century Germany and followed through in America in the 20th century. There was a second approach to this question of what do we do with prayers that we don't like, and that was offered by Abraham Joshua Heschel on the next night of the conference. And so I'm going to skip down to the second paragraph here from Heschel under solution number 2. He says, this is our affliction. He said, this is our affliction. We do not know how to look across a word to its meaning. We forgot how to find the way to the word, how to be on intimate terms with a few passages in the prayer book. familiar with all words, we are intimate with none. The same word may evoke new understanding when read with an open heart. What we need is a sympathetic prayer book exegesis. Exegesis means interpretation. Okay, so what Heschel is suggesting here is that there is another way, I'm stopping the share for a second, there's another way of thinking about how we might relate to the words of prayer, because if you hold up the words of prayer to a thumbs up, thumbs down vote, you actually are voting on a word or a phrase that you don't really have an intimate connection to. We forgot how to find the way to the word, he says. And what we need instead of sort of simple accept or reject is a deeper relationship with the word, what he calls a prayer book exegesis, a sympathetic prayer book exegesis, sort of an emotional interpretation of the words that may take us to a new place in terms of where we relate to these words. Right, now Cantor Lippitz is asking, okay, well, what about Shalo Asani Isha? Thank you, God, who did not make me a woman. And I think you can always find certain categories of prayers that are going to push the boundaries here. And you might go back to Cohen's approach and say, you know what? We can't actually hold on to any of these words. We have to cut them or change them. And that's certainly an option. But what I want to explore with you today is maybe there are some words that we think we have some troubles with, or maybe we just have no feelings toward. And we're going to think about how we might develop those feelings and those relationships through the process of interpretation. And at the very least, what I'll leave you with is a method in which you could apply to the Siddur more generally, and hopefully open up new pathways to what it means to read and understand and connect to the words of prayer. Now, what Heschel said is that we're familiar with all prayers, but we're intimate with none. And I would just want to say, for those of you who are not even familiar with prayers, not even familiar with the words that we're going to look at today, you're way ahead of the game, because you don't bring any of the baggage and interpretation that you already are bringing into the room because you've said these words dozens of times or hundreds or thousands of times. So if you have no connection to the prayers, I'd say you're in a good place. If you're somebody who said the words of prayers before, then I'm going to ask you to sort of suspend judgment while we go through an interpretive process together. And that's hard to do because you have connection to, what you think the words mean, and that's fine. I don't want to reject that. But I want us to stand at these words from an orientation of curiosity as opposed to one in which I already know what these words mean. This is, of course, going to be the hardest for the rabbis on the call and the cantors on the call. So I'm gonna ask you to try the hardest of let's see where this takes us before we bring in our own interpretations that we've been holding on to for many years. Okay, I'm going to introduce the text of the prayer that we're going to look at, which is, I would say, a lot of bang for your buck in terms of its frequency in Jewish prayer. It's the first blessing of the Amida. The Amida is the standing prayer that you recite at every single Jewish prayer service. It even takes more precedence than the Shema. And it's structured in a way that the beginning blessings and the end blessings, no matter if it's weekday or Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur or Shabbat or Pesach, you're always going to say the same beginning and ending blessings of that prayer. So anytime you ever get to pray, you're going to encounter this in a Jewish public prayer service. You're going to get to encounter this prayer, and that's the prayer we're going to sort of put up on the examining table to see if we could create some connection and interpretation to it. So it's what I want to encourage us to do is to approach the text that I'm about to share with you, that first blessing of the Amida, from a standpoint of curiosity and questioning. And this is my assignment to you that you're going to take on right now, which is I'm going to read to you the prayer. I'm going to read it to you in Hebrew and then in English. And then I'm going to ask you to ask as many questions about the prayer as you can. It's almost like we're studying Torah together. When you read the Torah, you don't say like, oh, this was easy, I got it, totally simple. You say, oh, this was confusing, I'm not sure what it means. Let me ask a question. Let's see if Rashi had a question. Okay, questioning is the first step of interpretation, and that's what I'm going to invite us all to do today. So this is not, I know sometimes Jews ask questions, but they end it with an exclamation point instead of a question mark. So this is going to be questions with a question mark, okay? So it'd be like, why is this word? What does this word mean? What is this phrase mean? Why is this word double? And it could be big, big theological questions like, what does it mean to bless God? or it could be small grammatical questions like, why is this in the third person, not in the second person? Anything that comes to mind, any question is fair game. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen again. We're going to look at this blessing. I should say two words of warning. Number one, it's the traditional Ashkenazi version of this blessing. That is to say, it does not include the imahot. I don't know where your shul is on that, but this is sort of if we're taking the ancient form of this blessing, that's what we're looking at here. And number two is I didn't write the blessing, so if you don't like it, don't blame me. Okay, so we're gonna take a look at this together. I'm gonna share the screen once again. Okay, so I'm on the bottom of page 1, and Justin, I don't know if you were able to share that Google Doc, but meanwhile, I'm just gonna read it to you. I'll read it to you in the Hebrew. I'm going to read it to you in the English. You can quibble with the translation if you want, but it'll at least be a starting point. Okay, so I'm going to read it to you in the Hebrew first, and what you're going to be thinking of is questions that come up based on this text. Okay, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Be'Elohei Avotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Be'Elohei Yaakov. Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanora El Elyon El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim V'Konei Hakol. That got reshuffled. V'Zocher Chastei Avot Umevi Goel Livnei V'Neihem L'Ma'an Shemo B'Yahava Melech Ozer Umoshia Umagen Baruch Atah Adonai Magen Abraham. The Amida, as you might encounter it in any traditional Jewish prayer service. All right, I'm going to read it to you in the English. Blessed are you, God, or Yud-Hey Vav-Hey, our God and God of our ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Great, mighty, and awesome God, God Most High, who performs acts of loving kindness and creator of all, and remembers the loving kindness of our ancestors, and brings a redeemer to their children's children for his name's sake with love. Helping, saving, and shielding King, blessed are you, Yud-Hey-Vav-Hey, God, shield of Abraham. Okay, that's the blessing. That's what we're talking about here. I numbered it 1 through 10, so that's just my overlay, just for ease of reference. But I want us to sort of explore this and ask as many questions as we can about this. So you can either drop the question into the chat if that's a reasonable approach for you. If you wanna, we can even, I think it's a crowd we can try this with. If you want to unmute and ask your question, you're welcome to ask your question as well orally. So I'm going to invite those questions now. Okay, so Dr. Ron is saying, what about the matriarchs? And we're going to get back to that. So what you're noticing is in line 2, let's say. I'm going to add this in the Hebrew here, line 2. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. There are no matriarchs. Where are they? What about them? And I would sort of add to that question and say, what about line 10? We have shield of Abraham, and we no longer have Isaac and Jacob. That is to say, in line 2, we had God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, the patriarchs. But by the time we get to line 10, we've got no more Isaac and Jacob. We're just down to Abraham. So good. So and now Rabbi Lisa's saying, well, what about these particular people? Why are we naming these particular people? What's the point of naming them? Why do we have to name our ancestors at all? We know who they are, and certainly God knows who they are. Doesn't God know that God is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob? Why am I telling that to God? We all know this. And why these 3 as opposed to either the matriarchs or any other? If you were going to sort of list top daveners in Jewish history, you might have included King David, who wrote the book of Psalms. According to Jewish tradition. So what's the point of name? Okay, so that's a lot on line 2. Let's get some other questions out there. Charles is asking further, what do we mean by blessed? Who are we to bless God, right? It sounds a little daring for us to say, blessed are you, God. And what are we actually trying to accomplish there? And is the word blessed the right translation for Baruch? Could we think of something else that, how that functions? Other questions that people have on these texts as they come in here. Good. Leia's asking, Why is it, I'm in line 3, great, mighty, and awesome. Why is it great and mighty and awesome? Like, what's the difference between great and mighty? Is there really do I need to say over and over again that God is awesome? And if I did, what's the difference between great and awesome? So why am I doing that? Okay, Nomi is saying, what about line 8? Yeah, brings a redeemer to his children's children. If I say the word redeemer, you might think, it has, in English anyways, connotations of Christianity, like Church of the Redeemer. So who's the redeemer that's being brought for his children? And who are the children's children? Right? What's the children's children of whom? Is it the children's children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Is it our children's children? Is it someone else? It's not exactly very clear. Okay, David Ackerman is asking, what about chesed in lines 5 and 7, right? You see there's some chesed, loving kindness, as it's translated here, performs acts of loving kindness and remembers the loving kindness of the ancestors. So, what's the way in which that's functioning in relationship to God's awesomeness? Is awesome the same as the God who loves us with loving kindness? How does that play out? And Dave is saying, well, wait a minute, helping, saving, and shielding in line 9. I haven't seen that recently. God is not holding up God's part of the bargain, perhaps. And so how am I supposed to say the words that are, complimenting God on being a shielding and protecting king? You might sort of connect that to David's point of, is God really a God of chesed or no? So, how am I supposed to compliment God, even if I think that there's such a thing as complimenting God? How can I compliment God on things that I'm not sure are actually happening here? Okay, let's see a few more. Line 5, loving kindness seems extreme considering they did a lot of non-virtuous acts, right? If you're talking about the ancestors, Abraham, Rabbi Cooper just said that, Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac. Not a lot of chesed there, not a lot of loving kindness in that act. So what's going on? Are we sort of whitewashing the ancestors? And what's the point of sort of calling out their chesed angle? Yeah, everybody does a little chesed in their life, but overall, are they the kind of people that you would say is really to be remembered by that? Okay, there's a lot of questions here that we could ask. And again, what you've just done is amazing because you've opened up the text to interpretation. That is to say, you've started to engage with it and ask questions and say, I'm curious about it. Like, what does this mean? How am I supposed to say it? Now, at this point, we might actually be worse off than we were 5 minutes ago, because now having thought about this text for a little bit, it's like, you know what? I'm not sure I want to say these words. I never really stopped and thought about them, but now that I did, it's not really working for me. So that's something that I'm going to think about in the next part of our time together, which is, well, how do we connect to these words in a way that's actually going to bring us in deeper to them as opposed to, push us farther away from them? And that's what I want to explore with you here. But I just want to stop and say, if you have questions that you didn't get to ask yet, anytime you ever go to synagogue, anytime you ever pray with Jews, you'll have the opportunity to encounter this paragraph again, and you can spend some time asking more questions about it. I really feel like that's the first step of creating a relationship with the words, is just coming from a place of curiosity. Okay, we've done that really well. There's some questions that we're going to explore further, some that I'll leave for our next time to learn together. I'm actually writing a book on the entire Amida, and a lot of these questions are questions that I've heard in different formats of teaching over the years, and I really appreciate your willingness to dive in and ask. Okay, I'm going to share one overarching approach to how we might take the next step beyond the questions, that is, how might we interpret, and then we're going to go through and run some examples here, and I think you'll see a little bit of what I'm talking about in terms of this method. So I'm going to reshare the screen again and just put up on the screen one other helpful guide here, which is two sentences from Reuven Kimmelman. Reuven Kimmelman is a professor at Brandeis for a long time, Jewish studies professor, and writes a lot about liturgy. And he says, the meaning of the liturgy exists not so much in the liturgical text per se, as in the interaction between the liturgical text and the biblical intertext. Meaning in the mind of the reader takes place between texts rather than within them. All right, let's unpack what he has to say. I brought this just because Hebrew's not the only hard language out there. English is also hard, or at least academic English. But let's just break it down to what he's actually trying to say. What Kimmelman is saying is that when you read the Siddur, when you read a prayer, the prayer always, in fact, has another text that stands behind it, called the biblical intertext. That is to say, the Siddur text, the prayer book text, is quoting the Bible. And the Bible has a whole bunch of other connotations that are connected to it. And you can only really make sense of the Siddur text when you link it to its biblical source text. And the meaning is created when you bring those texts in dialogue with each other. Okay, if that sounds a little theoretical, I'm going to show you a practical example based on our text here, and we'll see how this works. But the bottom line is, if all you ever did was open the Siddur and looked at the words in the Siddur alone, in the prayer book alone, you would miss a whole range of texts that are going to help us make a connection to the words, and that's what we're going to explore here together. Okay, so let's go back to line 2, which we spent some time on here. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. We asked, where's Sarah, Rachel, Rebecca, Leah? We asked, why these three? We could ask also, why does it say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, right? It could have just said God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? In other words, why do I have to repeat the word God of, God of, God of? Now, you could make up an interpretation about that. Well, Abraham had a different relationship with God than Isaac had, and Jacob had a different relationship than his parents, and that's lovely, and it's an old Hasidic interpretation of this line. But what I'm telling you is, the reason that it's Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, and these three and no others, is because it's actually a direct quote from the Bible, from a scene that has nothing to do really with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're going to go to that scene now, okay? So let's scroll down to page 2, and I'm in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus. Chapter 3 of the book of Exodus is the scene of Moshe encountering God at the burning bush. I'm going to read it to you in the English. God said, "Do not come closer. Remove your shoes from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground." God said, "I am the God of your father, Anochi Elohei Avicha," the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. There's our phrase, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. What happened? Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Okay, so that's the scene that we are in here, the scene of the burning bush, the scene in which Moshe is called into service to go redeem the Jewish people. Talk about line 8 and the Redeemer. Well, maybe Moshe is playing some role there. And indeed, Moshe is the child of the child of the child of Jacob. And so what we have here is a scene in which Moshe is encountering God really for the first time. Now, when Moshe's at the burning bush, do you remember how old Moshe is? It says it straight out in the Torah. It's a great thing for anybody who thinks they're over the hill. Moshe is 80 years old when Moshe encounters God at the burning bush, and that is the beginning of his real career, right? Nobody really stops somebody on the street and says, "Tell me something about Moses." They're not really going to tell you anything that he did from ages 0 to 80. What they're going to tell you is what he did from ages 80 to 120. That is to say, what he did to redeem the Jewish people from the land of Egypt, and that he stood up to Pharaoh, and that he split the sea, and that he gave the law, and all that stuff. That's coming from Moshe. But right now, where is Moshe in his life? Moshe is hanging out in Midian. You know where Midian is? Nobody else does either, right? If the whole Torah is about going from the land of Eretz Yisrael, land of Canaan, to the land of Egypt, back and forth, and the patriarchs go down, go back, go down, go back, and then they get stuck there, and then they get out, right? That's the basic story of the Torah. But Midian is not a part of that drama. If you're in Midian, you're like in, Western Pennsylvania. You're not on the Northeast corridor, okay? You're off the track. And that's where Moshe is, and he's pretty happy there. Who did he marry? He married Tzipporah. Who's Tzipporah? She's the daughter of a Midianite priest named Jethro. He's just off the Jewish story. He ran away from the Jewish people, having killed an Egyptian taskmaster. And so he's built a life for himself as a shepherd, and he's doing pretty well. And when he comes to encounter God at the burning bush, God says, "I'm going to ask you to go into Egypt and redeem the Jewish people." And what does Moshe say? I'd rather not. Like, no, thank you. I'll take anybody else but me. I can't speak. I am unable to form the words. You got the wrong guy, right? This is Moshe's approach, having been confronted with the opportunity of his life to really do the mission that he was put on this world to do. He says, no, I'd rather not. Okay. Now, this is the scene of the burning bush, but I want to bring it back to our scene of like a regular Jew praying the Amida, right? When we say Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, first of all, who's speaking? It's not us speaking, it's God speaking. That is to say, we are quoting God speaking to Moshe. But let's say for now, Moshe is us. Like, we are the alienated Jew who's run away from his future and his people and is hanging out as a shepherd in Midian, just like off the grid, okay? And in that moment, God encounters us, and God says, I am the God of your ancestors, Elohei Avotenu, right? We say it in first person, but God says it in second person, the God of your father. I'm the God of God of our ancestors, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. So when I'm standing there in prayer, in some ways, I'm meant to embody this moment of encounter that Moshe experiences at the burning bush. And that's the first time that Moshe really hears God's voice. Wouldn't it be nice if in prayer we took each time we said the Amida as if it was the first time of us standing before God? And it's a moment for us to think about, well, what's the mission of my life? Am I doing it, or am I running away from it and would rather be a shepherd in Midian, as it were, like the proverbial off the beaten path, okay? And that's an opportunity that I think in terms of prayer is an invitation to thinking about our own life, our purpose in the world, and why we're here on planet Earth, right? As opposed to what it seems like at first glance, which is, God, you're the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. I'm about to ask you for a bunch of stuff. So, let's just establish that I have some yichus here. So I'm going to mention my ancestors first. And while I'm mentioning them, I might as well mention Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, and everybody else who I should be mentioning to sort of situate myself. What I'm instead suggesting is we are Moshe standing at the burning bush. God is speaking to us and inviting us into the mission of our lives that we are oriented to ignore. We are programmed to say no thank you. And what the Amida is here offering us an opportunity to do is to say, maybe we should reconsider. Maybe there's something that we haven't yet done in our life that, like Moshe at the burning bush, is awaiting us, but we just haven't dived in, okay? So I'm going to stop here for 1 second and just say, this is the method of looking at the prayer in light of its biblical intertext, of the biblical context of the prayer line, okay? And basically, every line of prayer, almost without exception, every line of the Siddur is a quote from the Bible. So you can pretty much always go to the Bible and say, well, what is the context of this line in the Bible? And could that add to my understanding and interpretation of the meaning behind this prayer? Okay, so just in terms of the method, I hope you get the method. Feel free to unmute, ask a question or chat a question. But the method is basically take the line of prayer, look for its location in the Bible, and once you have those two opportunities to look at the text, then you can start to create some meaning. So my attempt at creating meaning is to say we are standing in the place of Moshe. We are alienated both from our people and from our mission in life. And this is an opportunity to come back in. You can come up with your own interpretation. But the point is if you don't have Moshe at the burning bush, you kind of missed the big part of what this line is driving us towards. It's driving us towards a scene that actually doesn't really concern Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It really concerns Moshe, but not even the Moshe who's splitting the sea and giving the law, but the Moshe who wants to run away from his own future and responsibility, which may be a feeling that we might be familiar with from our own life, depending on where we are. Okay, that's the method. That's where we are. I'm gonna. If anybody has any thoughts, reactions, questions, I'm happy to take a sip of this tea and hear anything there. And then I'm going to show you a few more examples of this. so you can get it really down. It says that we might think of these as famous movie lines that bring back the whole scene. We don't think of the Bible anymore as something that is like in our collective memory, the quotable lines. But what are the quotable phrases? If I say whatever, like my country, 'tis of thee, there's a stand-in there for something larger and longer. And all I have to do is quote the first line, and you're sort of running through the rest of the song in your head. And that's in some ways what the effect of the Siddur is in these prayers that they're offering us. That is to say, there's so many references that are floating around here, and that's an opportunity to go deeper into what the person who wrote the prayers had in mind. Now you might say, well, that's very good for somebody who's memorized the Bible, but how am I supposed to deal with it? And I would say to you, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but that doesn't take away from the fact that this is how the Siddur was constructed. That it's, if you want to understand the Siddur on its own terms, you want to understand prayers on their own terms, you have to recognize that, yeah, they were quoting the Bible. So it's on us to find out what they were quoting before we strike the line or muck around with it, just to see if there's anything waiting there for us. Feel free to continue to send questions in the chat. I'm going to explore. I'm really fostering a return to deeper study of Tanakh, right? I mean, I think study of the Bible. Sometimes the Jews forget the Bible, and indeed we are the people of the book. That's the book they're talking about. So I think in some ways it would be refamiliarizing ourselves with the Bible. But even people who really know the Bible, and it's not just the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, but it's really the whole Bible that the Siddur is drawing from. It is some work. It is some work to do this. And in fact, there were 2 books that were written in the Middle Ages that went through the Siddur phrase by phrase and hyperlinked it to the line in the Bible, just so you had like a guide, in case you didn't memorize the whole Bible and could understand it off the top of your head. They made a guide and they said, you want to know what the Siddur is quoting? Here's the line it's quoting, and here's the next line it's quoting, etc. So there are some tools to do this if you're interested in it. But even if you're not going to go through this project on your own, I just want you to see how it works for a few of the lines of the Siddur, just so we can think about how the Siddur is constructed and how we might make meaning out of it. Now I want to go to the next line, which is again a strange line. El Hagadol Hagibor Bahanora, the great, mighty, and awesome God, the God who is great, mighty, and awesome. And we ask ourselves, what's the difference between great and mighty, and why do we have to mention 3 adjectives? And doesn't God know that God is great, mighty, and awesome? Why am I telling God that God is great, mighty, and awesome? Does God have an ego that God needs to hear this? Like, what's the point of saying these adjectives here? So I'm going to reshare the screen and show you a little story about somebody who got carried away with this line, and we'll see the reaction of that story of a rabbi who heard this prayer leader go on a little bit on this line. Okay, so we're looking up, just going to look at it for 1 second. The bottom of page 1 again. We're in line 3. We did line 2, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And what we're looking at here is line 3, the great, mighty, and awesome God. Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. What could that mean? Okay, so I'm scrolling down to page 3, and we're going to read this little story here from the Babylonian Talmud. There was once one who prayed the Amida before Rabbi Hanina. Okay, so this anonymous prayer leader, the cantors never get credit, anonymous prayer leader who leads the prayers before Rabbi Hanina. And he said, El Hagadol, Hagibor Vahanora, the great, mighty, and awesome, but added, powerful, strong, courageous God. El Hagadol, Hagibor Vahanora, Adir Vachazak V'Amitz. Okay, so he takes the 3 adjectives that we have, great, mighty, and awesome, and he doubles it, right? Goes down and says another 3 adjectives, powerful, strong, and courageous. Now, you might ask yourself, well, I didn't even know the difference between great and mighty, and now you're adding strong and courageous. Like, what is the difference between each of these adjectives? So what's motivating this prayer leader to add adjectives? Presumably, the more adjectives you have, the closer you are to describing God. And that's something that's good. But that is not the reaction of Rabbi Hanina. Rabbi Hanina hears this doubling of the praises in the Amida and says the following. He says, have you finished all the possible praise of your master? Have you finished praising God? Were it not that they were written by Moshe in the Torah and affixed by the men of the great assembly, leave that crew for a second, we would not even say these three descriptions. We wouldn't even say great, mighty, and awesome if they weren't written by Moshe in the Torah. But you go on saying all of these, it may be compared to a human king who had thousands upon thousands of gold coins, and people praised him for owning silver. Isn't that a terrible degradation of him? Okay, so what's the challenge here? What's the problem with saying powerful, strong, courageous God? It's limiting. You think that with 6 adjectives you covered your bases in a way that with 3 adjectives you didn't? Come on, who are you kidding? You know how long shul would be if you were gonna truly describe God? Forget about it. We'd be here till infinity. There would be no kiddush. You'd be coming up with every adjective known to human language, and you still would only be praising silver, even though God has thousands and thousands of gold coins. There's no describing God. You can't do it. You cannot describe God. So don't think with a few extra adjectives you've done anything. So now you have to ask yourself, like, let's say I'm convinced. By the way, Maimonides loved this text. This is where Maimonides derived his principle that you can never say anything about God. You can only say what God isn't, right? You can never say what God is, say what God isn't. Okay, maybe that takes shorter. But the bottom line here is that when you're trying to describe what God is, it's a doomed project from the beginning. You can't do it. Human language doesn't work for describing an otherworldly God. So what's the point of saying? I get it. You've convinced me. So I should cut Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah. I should just say Ha'el, the God. I'm not going to even describe God as great, mighty, and awesome. Never mind adding more adjectives, right? So what's the reason that we say great, mighty, and awesome at all, as opposed to saying nothing? The reason that Rabbi Hanina says here is, it was written by Moshe in the Torah. That's the only reason we can say these adjectives, because Moshe wrote it in the Torah, okay? And affixed by the men of the Great Assembly. So the men of the Great Assembly, we'll get to that in a second. That's later prophets. In the rabbi's view, Nehemiah and Ezra were members of that crew. They're later books of the Bible. But in the Torah itself, these adjectives only come in one scene that's actually quoting Moshe. That is, say Moshe says these words in the Torah. Okay, so let's just take a look at them just so we can get a sense of what does it mean to say God is great, mighty, and awesome. And if I say to you, God is great, mighty, and awesome, by the way, forget about the limits of human language. If I say to you that God is great, mighty, and awesome, what did God do to become great, mighty, and awesome? Why might I be tempted to say God is great, mighty, and awesome? Well, I don't know. Let's think about it. What's great and mighty and awesome about God's actions? Which actions did God do that were great, mighty, and awesome? Might be create the world, split the sea, deliver the Jews from Egypt, give the law, right? There are a lot of miraculous actions that God does that might be considered great, mighty, and awesome in the category generally of things you and I can't do, but only God can do. So maybe that's what it means for God to be great, mighty, and awesome. But what I want to say to you is, God being great, mighty, and awesome is something that the Torah is going to upend what we might have thought that is and show us a different view of that kind of God. So let's look at it. Again, great, mighty, and awesome only comes once in all of the Torah, said by Moshe in the 5th book of the Torah in Deuteronomy, chapter 10, verses 17 through 19. I'm going to read it to you in the English. For God, your God, is the God of gods and the Lord of lords. Ha'el, HaGadol, HaGibor, VaHaNorah. The great, mighty, and awesome God, who, let's understand what this means, who shows no favor, takes no bribe, who does justice for the orphan and widow, and loves the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. Then the Torah goes on, you too must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay, so what's striking to me about this biblical passage here is that God is described exactly in the same language as our line in the Amida. God is Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah, the great, mighty, and awesome God, but upending what we might have assumed gives God that set of adjectives instead of created the world, split the sea, brought the flood, chased out these kingdoms, etc. It rather is things that humans who are behaving ethically can also do. Takes no bribe, right? Shows no favor. If you're a judge, shows no favor, only sort of just the facts and the truth. Does justice for the widow and the orphan, two categories of people who are often maligned by society and never taken care of. And loving the stranger. I mean, who loves the stranger in this world? Loving the stranger. That's what God does to be great, mighty, and awesome. It's sort of an upending of the associations with Gibor means a hero, right? What does it mean for God to be a hero? Not that God can lift up, the rock that God can't lift up, but instead, God is showing justice to the widow, orphan, and stranger. Things that are heroic and things that are within our grasp. Not only that, the Torah says, not only can you do them, you have to do them. You must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So for God to be a great, mighty, and awesome God, understanding that this is the quote where we're taking it from the Amida, it means God loves the stranger, widow, and orphan, and you better do that too. And by the way, love is cheap. Words are cheap. But how does God love the stranger? Giving giving the stranger food and clothing. That is to say, it's chesed, it's love that has action behind it. It's love that is about taking care of someone, not just I love you from afar. So this is, again, an opportunity to think about when we say the line, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor Ba'anara, the great, mighty, and awesome God, that we say in our Amida. Well, it can't be describing God. You can't describe God. That's like a failed endeavor. You cannot use adjectives to describe God. God is indescribable. What we're doing instead, I'm arguing, is quoting the line from the Torah that reminds us as people how we need to behave in the world. And here I'm actually less interested in your conception of God and more interested in what is the way in which, by reciting that quote, we might orient ourselves towards an ethical day of behavior and action in our own life. Forget about what God is or isn't doing. What we can be doing in our world, in our relationships, that's part of what this line could draw us to consider. So what I'm saying in the Amida, I am not describing God. You can't describe God. What I am doing instead is reminding myself that like God loves the stranger, you too must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay, I'm stopping the share here for a second. I'm opening up for any thoughts, reactions, responses, concerns, questions about either the method, taking the Siddur line and connecting it to the Bible and its context, or any of the specific points that we've been making here. I'm just going to take another sip of tea. If any of you presented on Zoom, it's like a marathon here. You're just talking into the ether. So now your turn to put something out there.
Why did the rabbis not refer to the feeding and clothing the stranger? Why did they pick the adjectives? They could have picked the actions.
I love that question. It's such a good question because it's sort of like, all right, granted that I'm quoting the Bible, but why wouldn't they quote the Bible part that sort of drives home the point of my ethical behavior as opposed to the part which would confuse me and think that I'm actually describing God with these adjectives? And I think in that way, you have to just understand the Siddur as poetic as opposed to prose. Now, when I was in college, I dated a poet. Why did I date a poet? I mean, for many reasons, but the fact that she was a poet was, for me, it was sort of tantalizing. I would read her poetry and I would be like, what does this mean? Like, can you explain it to me? Can you just tell me what you're trying to say? And it was like, no, it's, what do you think it means? And, I can't unpack it. It's something that's more inchoate than prose. It's like, okay, there's something mysterious and beautiful about poetry. It's like, why do people read poems? Why don't you just tell me what you're saying instead of like hiding it in language that's hard to understand? But that's the orientation of the Siddur. The Siddur is quoting the beginning of something, but not the end of it. You're saying, why not just quote the end of it? The end of it was so much clearer. But that's the way the Siddur operates. It's sort of it's more in the mysterious side. And in that way, perhaps as David was suggesting, it's sort of counterintuitive. It's fooling you into thinking. I mean, that's certainly that prayer leader in the story thought that he was describing God. And so it's sort of fooling you into thinking that that's happening. When you stop and say, wait a minute, I can't really be describing God. Let me think about this more. Then you sort of go into the next verse and see, oh, it's actually about loving the stranger, widow, and orphan. So I think your question is so on point. It's like, why wasn't the Siddur just clear about its agenda? And to answer it, you have to say it's a poetic, stylized approach to what it means to sort of use words to relate to God, which might not be the most clear, certainly not the most clear, but maybe sort of interesting and mysterious in the way that, again, it's like with Shakespeare, let's take something that we're all at least, bought into. With Shakespeare, it's like you read Shakespeare, like, could you just tell me what you're trying to say? Like, did you have to say it in iambic pentameter, or could you just like write it out for me in a sort of, Cliff Notes version so that I could just understand what King Lear is talking about? And it's like, yeah, you could do that, but then it wouldn't be Shakespeare. It would just be Cliff Notes, which is kind of boring. So, you could love it or not love it, but that's what the Siddur is. And it's just helpful, I think, to understand what form of art it is, as opposed to, just tell me what you mean.
The poetry of it allows everyone to both struggle and connect in their own way, and gives it much more expansive, both across a time frame and across history, a much more expansive usage and value. It's kind of like the way I like when I teach Tanakh. I like to find ways that we can connect what the messages there to, or what's going on there, to something that's going on in our own world today. And I always point out that the Tanakh is the only 3,000-year-old document that A, we're still reading, and B, still has things to say for us today. And in much the same way, by leaving it poetic rather than prose-like, it allows the same prayer to speak to us today, maybe in a different way, but to still speak to us just as it spoke to those ancestors who created it in the first place.
Yeah, thank you for that that framing. And I want to say that, what we're left with here is, one of the questions in the chat, I think, raised this about Melech Hoser Moshe Magen, like God is helping, saving, shielding, king. Well, wait a minute. What if God isn't taking care of the widow, orphan, and stranger in the way that is serving as a model for me? Like, what if that's not something that I'm actually watching, and seeing that as a model? And that's also something that the rabbis grapple with. And I want to move to that text. By the way, I don't do it for every group, but I can see that this group really, really struggles with this question. And so we're gonna give it a shot. And in order to do this, I'm just gonna sort of load it up with a couple of preambles. One is to say, of course, the problem of evil and the problem of a God who wasn't coming through on God's promises is not new. That's obviously something the ancients also struggled with. And there was no time, where God was sort of operating in a world which was perfectly nirvana-like. I mean, there was the Garden of Eden, but that didn't last too long. The rabbinic period lasted about a few hours. So what about the real world that we live in? And is any of this something that we can relate to in our real lives, as opposed to an imagined life with an imagined God? And so that's sort of one thing, is that this is not a new problem. It's a problem that the ancients struggled with as well. And the other, more technical, is I said that God is great, mighty, and awesome. That only comes once in all the Torah, and that's true. It only comes in that line with Moshe describing God as the one who loves widow, orphan, and stranger. But it does come one other time in full in the Bible, and that's the men of the Great Assembly. It comes in the book of Nehemiah, later on in the Bible, when the Jews returned to Zion after their first exile. And it comes almost exactly the same, but not quite the same, in two other books of the Bible, in Jeremiah and in Daniel. So what you have is 4 versions of God as great, mighty, and awesome that actually show up in 4 different places in the Bible, different contexts for each of them. And there's an amazing Talmudic passage that sort of weaves that data together to give voice to, I think, some of the questions that we're asking here, which is, what am I supposed to do in a world in which God isn't operating as the God who loves the widow, orphan, and stranger? How are we supposed to do that? Okay, Charles is asking, well, how are we supposed to deal with the fact that we mumble through a lot of passages through the Siddur? And this sounds like a reasonable approach, but only if you're going really slow. And I would say to you, yes, 100%. But this is definitely not something that you're able to do at the speed of davening. You cannot be doing this interpretation in the speed of davening. But in that way, it's also like reading Torah. Like when you read Torah, you're not stopping and discovering every Rashi, every midrash, every question that you could ask on a verse. You're just motoring along to the next verse. And in some ways, you have to sort of distinguish between what are we doing right now publicly versus what do these words mean? In other words, you can read the Torah really fast and say, I didn't catch everything there from the deepest angle, but I know there's a lot there if we just stopped and looked at it. And that's why people study the Torah, as apparently you're doing with Rabbi Lisa. But the same is true of the Siddur. The same is true of the Siddur in the way in which you can stop and study it, and it takes a long time, just like the Torah. And you can read it really fast, and you have to decide what mode you're at relating to the Siddur in any given moment. Okay, let's jump into this amazing text that the rabbis put together on the problem of a God who's not really behaving in the way that I want God to behave, and how we're supposed to relate in that way. So I'm moving on to page 4. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are 4 places in the Bible where great, mighty, and awesome God is a great, mighty, and awesome God shows up, although only 2 of them are in full. Only 2 of them use the full adjectives of great, mighty, and awesome. And a few of them only use a few of the adjectives, like 2 out of 3, okay? So normally you get 3 adjectives, great, mighty, and awesome, but in a few of the passages you only get great and mighty or great and awesome, and we're gonna see how the rabbis understood that rupture there. Okay, Rabbi Simon said in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, why were they called the men of the great assembly? Why were they called the men of the great assembly? Because they returned greatness to its earlier place. All right, not sure exactly how meaningful this is. The Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the great assembly, why were they, what was so great about them? What was the Gedolah? What was the Gedulah that was related to them? Okay, it was because they returned greatness to its earlier place. I don't know what that means yet. Let's read on and see if we can figure this out. Rabbi Pinchas said, here we go. Moshe established the form of the Amida. Moshe is the one who wrote the Amida, which is to say, Moshe said, the great, mighty, and awesome God. That's the one that we just saw from Deuteronomy 10. Okay. Moshe said, the great, mighty, and awesome God. Jeremiah said, the great and mighty God, Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor, V'lo Amar HaNorah, but he did not say awesome. Okay, so Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 32:18, calls God great and mighty, but does not say awesome. Now, if you're just reading Jeremiah without any context, you'd be like, okay, Jeremiah is describing God. But if you know that awesome is usually supposed to be there, then there's a screaming gap that Jeremiah has created by leaving off the word awesome when Jeremiah describes God. So now the Talmud's going to inquire, why did Jeremiah say what Jeremiah said as opposed to what Moshe said? In other words, why did he cut the word awesome? Okay, so they first say, why did he say mighty? Why did Jeremiah say mighty? Why did Jeremiah call God mighty? One who can watch the destruction of his house and be quiet is fittingly called mighty. We'll come back to that in a second. Why didn't he say awesome? Why did Jeremiah cut the word awesome? Because only the temple is awesome. As it says, Norah Elohim mikdashecha. Awesome is God from his temple, from his sanctuary. Okay? So let's just understand what's happening here. When is Jeremiah living? What's happened? Jeremiah looks out his window, and what does Jeremiah see? Jeremiah sees the destruction of the whole Jewish enterprise, the destruction of the first temple, the end of the Commonwealth. Everything is falling apart. Okay, that's the reality that Jeremiah is living in. He's living in the generation of the Churban. He's living in the generation of the destruction. Okay, and so he looks out his window, he sees the temples burning, and he says, you know what? I can't say the word awesome. I got to cut it. Sorry, I'm not calling you no ra anymore, God. You're just not no ra. You're not awesome. The temple's burning, and you're not awesome. That's where Jeremiah is sort of registering his reality with his liturgy. He's editing, he's doing Eugene Cohn. He's editing his Siddur because he can't say the word awesome anymore. Now, why did he say Gibor? Like, if he's already cutting some adjectives, why not just cut them all? So why does he say Gibor? Because Ezehu Gibor, we learn in Pirkei Avot, who is mighty? HaKovesh et Yitzro, the one who conquers his will, right? The one who conquers his will is a Gibor. And indeed, God conquers God's will. God wanted to step in and save the destruction, but, held back. Gibor, Kovesh et Yitro, God conquered God's will and was quiet, and that's why God is called mighty. Now, you could read this in a pious way and say, well, Jeremiah is, those of us who are parents have been there. This is going to hurt me even more than it hurts you. It's like, if you don't do the punishment, then, no one will ever learn the lesson. And the Jewish people weren't exactly angels when the first temple was destroyed. And so this is God's response to a world in which all the ethics has gone off the rails. And so it's like, sorry, you're going to have to take the punishment. I'd like to save you, but I'm not going to. Or you could read it in a sort of critique way where Jeremiah is sort of saying, with friends like these, it's like, why is God holding back? God should be stepping in and saving us. And God isn't doing that. And so the only thing that I can call God is a real powerhouse in restraint. And I wish that God was a little less mighty so that God could save us. What can I do? God is Gibor. When I'm calling God Gibor, I'm not calling God the God who loves the widow, orphan, and stranger. I'm calling God the God who stays out of human affairs, even though God wants to step in, because that's the reality of our situation. That is to say, it's a critique adjective as opposed to sort of a wondrous adjective. God is mighty because it takes so much might for God not to step in, and nevertheless, God is holding back and letting the destruction happen, this destruction that's coming upon us, perhaps through our own sins and the society that we built. Okay, so you can take or leave, the judgment on why destruction happens, but I think what's important for us here is the statement that God is awesome is just not a statement that I can say anymore. And I'm the prophet Jeremiah. Like I'm not like a local yokel. It's like I believe in God. That's no question. God is speaking to me. I'm prophesying. But I'm going to cut words when I don't see them matching my reality. Or I'm going to reinterpret the word. Gibor used to mean love the widow and the orphan, and now it means holds back from stepping in to a scene of destruction. Same word, but just reinterpreted. Okay, so let's see how this moves on a little bit further, because we get two more examples of this phrase in the Bible. So the next example of this, we already saw Moshe, that was loving widow, orphan, and stranger. We saw Jeremiah, which is the temple is being destroyed. I can't say these words, or I'm going to reinterpret them to match my reality. Now we get Daniel. Now Daniel's living in exile. Daniel's already the next generation after the destruction. And Daniel in chapter 9, verse 4 says, Ha'el Hagadol V'Hanorah, the great and awesome God, but doesn't say Gibor. He cuts the word mighty. Mighty is not a word that Daniel uses. So let's investigate. Why does Daniel make this edit? And we know it's an edit because we know we have the longer version with all three adjectives from Moshe. So the great, awesome God, but did not say mighty. So Daniel says, his sons have been captured and imprisoned. So where's his might? What do you mean? I'm not going to call God mighty. I'm sitting here in exile. God's not mighty. That's clear. So I'm going to cut the word mighty. Okay, even though Jeremiah reinterpreted the word mighty to mean holds back, Daniel's like, sorry, mighty is not a word that I can say anymore. God's might is not on display if I'm in exile. So then you have to ask, so why did Daniel say awesome? Why did Daniel say Torah? For the awesome things that God did for us in the fiery furnace, he's fittingly called awesome. I think this is an important point. Daniel's sitting in exile. The Jewish people are suffering. They are not in their land, and they don't have self-control. Nevertheless, there are certain miracles that Daniel and Daniel's colleagues experienced from God, like being saved from the fiery furnace that they were thrown into as a punishment from King Nebuchadnezzar. God miraculously saved them. And I can call God awesome for the miracles that I experience in my life, even as my people are suffering. I think this is sort of like a classic survivor's generation conundrum. Like, how is it that I can have a nice house in the suburbs when my parents or my grandparents suffer through the Holocaust, to take an example? Like, how is it that anything good in my life could ever happen that I would ever praise God for when horrible, destructive things have happened to my people? Can I hold both of those things at the same time? And Daniel is saying, well, I'm not going to say the word Gibor anymore. I'm not going to give God the full praise line, but I am going to acknowledge that awesome things happened to me when I was even though I was in exile, awesome things are happening to me. And so even though Jeremiah said we only call God awesome if the temple's standing, Daniel says, you know what? I'm going to call God awesome because of the awesome things that God did for me in my life right now, in my personal life, in my family life, as opposed to only looking at this through the lens of the whole, which of course is suffering. And that's why he cuts the first line. Okay, we get to the last part of this midrash, the last part of this story. When the men of the great assembly arose, when this sort of governing body of the Jewish people arose, they returned greatness to its earlier place. They returned greatness to its earlier place, and they said, the great, mighty, and awesome God. That shows up in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 9, verse 32, in its full glory. Okay, so if Jeremiah cut one word, Daniel cut another word. It comes back with all three adjectives when you get to Nehemiah. Now, what's going on in Nehemiah? What's the historical sort of context of Nehemiah? Nehemiah is part of the return. Nehemiah is the return from exile. Nehemiah is rebuilding Jerusalem. Nehemiah is sort of planting the seeds for the Jewish commonwealth to restart. And in that way, the Jewish people are being, loved again by God. And great, mighty, and awesome is an operative word. So sort of what I'm offering here is two things. Number one, there is a struggle that the rabbis are giving voice to with, I look out my window, I don't see God loving the widow, orphan, and stranger. So that's going to have to impact my liturgy. I can't say all the words the same way I used to. I might reinterpret them. Like I might say Gibor doesn't mean giving food to widow, orphan, and stranger. And instead means holding back from stepping in to save us. But I can't look at the words in the same way. And at the same time, we are living in a sort of fluid world where it used to be that God had us in exile, and now we are returning. That's Nehemiah's point, is I'm going to restore these words. And you could ask ourselves right now, like you might have said, up until 1948, you wouldn't say Gadol Gibor V'Nora, but now you are able to return those words to their former glory because there is some sense of a return. There is some restoration here. Now, I'm not suggesting that this solves all problems of evil and theodicy, but that is indeed at least an old problem that they are trying to puzzle through in the Amida itself and in the interpretation of the Amida. Now, the member of the Shapiro family is asking, why use any limiting adjectives at all? Why not say God who is everything, right? God who is all. And I think that is a totally reasonable question. Like, davening would be a lot shorter if we didn't describe God or take out all the praise. And what if we just said God is everything? There is an opinion in the Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud, that says, there's a verse in Psalms that says, Lecha dumiyati la. To you, silence is praise. Lecha dumiyati la. And maybe that's the way it should be. Like, we just have silent meditation. No words are going to work here. And that's the way we should approach God. That is not the way, for better or for worse, that the Jewish people went. We went with a lot of words. I got my Siddur here. It's like, over 1,200 pages. We definitely didn't go with the silence approach. But I think having made that choice, we can hopefully try to understand at least the way in which those words work and the way in which each of the lines of the prayer have some sort of deeper meaning than we might just understand on its surface level. And sort of give credit, give possibility to a deeper interpretive plane here, as opposed to sort of our first blush reaction to the words. Okay, Nomi's asking if there are any special tefillot that are written during the last pandemic that we can adapt today. It's interesting you asked that. I was exploring like what did the Jewish people come up with in previous plagues and pandemics, and there is actually one midrashic tradition. You may not get into this. There was a midrashic tradition that explains that the antidote to a plague is the ketoret, is the sweet-smelling incense that is a big part of the book of Leviticus and sort of the sacrificial system. So there is a prayer that's recited in memory of the incense called Pitum Aktoret. And there are some ancient prayer books, ancient meaning medieval prayer books, that actually say, let's say that prayer as a way of acknowledging that we're in a pandemic and we need some healing. It was sort of a healing concoction. So the recipe, if you think about it, is like ancient medicine. The recipe of the incense was complicated and had some healing powers to it. So that was, if you're asking traditionally, what did Jews say when they were confronted with a pandemic or a plague? That was one of them. But there's a lot of interesting new prayers that are being written today that might even be more meaningful on that front. I want to take our last few minutes before any final questions and just look at the last phrase of our Amida, because I think it's helpful, especially on these questions, bigger questions of doubt and questioning God's actions in the world. And that's the last line of the prayer, which says, "Blessed are you, God, shield of Abraham." Magen Abraham, shield of Abraham. That's line 10 on the first page. And it's, in fact, we saw earlier, we asked, like, where did Isaac and Jacob go? Like at the end of the whole prayer, it should at least have said, Magen Avot, shield of the ancestors, or Magen Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov, shield of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you want to throw in anyone else you want to, fine. But it ends shield of Abraham. Now, at least, hopefully up until now, I've convinced you that why does it say shield of Abraham? Because somewhere in the Torah, somewhere in the Bible, it's going to say God is the shield of Abraham. And indeed, that happens only one time in the Bible where God is called shield of Abraham. God calls God's self shield of Abraham. And that's the last scene I want to look at with you as we near the end of our time. So I'm going to share the screen one more time. We're going to skip ahead to page 6 if you're following along on the other sheet. And we're at chapter 15 in Genesis. We just read this last week. Okay, after those things, I'm in the bold, after those things, the word of Hashem came to Avram in a vision saying, "Don't fear, Avram, I am a shield for you. Anochi magen lach, I am a shield for you. Your reward will be very great." Okay, now if God comes and says to Avram, "Don't fear, al tira," how is Avram feeling? Probably feeling afraid, right? If God says, "Don't be afraid," then that only kind of makes sense in a world in which Avram is afraid. Okay, so what's Avram afraid of? Let's find out, because Avram's actually going to give voice to this right now. But Avram said, "Lord Hashem, what can you give me? Matitainli, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless? And the one in charge of my household is Damesek Eliezer," whoever that is. Avram said, "Since you granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir." Right? What's the complaint that Avram says here? What's causing Avram the fear? Avram is saying, "I'm not getting any younger. I don't have any kids. You promised me there were going to be kids. And all I see is my household servant, this guy named Damesek Eliezer, and he's going to inherit everything. He's going to take over my legacy, and that's not what we had in mind." That's what's giving Avram this sense of fear, okay? Now, God responds and says, the word of Hashem came to Avram saying, "That one shall not be your heir." In other words, your servant is not going to inherit you. None but your very own issue shall be your heir. You're going to have a child. He took him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you're able to count them." And he added, "So shall your offspring be." You're going to have as many kids as there are stars in the sky. And because he put his trust in Hashem, he reckoned it to his merit. So it's a very simple scene of Avram says, "Where are my kids? I don't see the kids coming." And God says, "Just you wait. You're going to have so many kids, you're not even going to be able to count them. And in that way, it's just a renewal of the promise that God made to Abraham back in chapter 12, that you're going to have you will be a great nation. You're going to have a lot of kids. And, don't worry. Okay, so far, so good. Now, there were two promises that God makes to Abraham back in chapter 12 when they first get together. One is that you're going to have many kids. And the second is that you're going to inherit this land. The land is going to be yours as well. So God figures, while I renewed promise number 1 about the kids, let me renew promise number 2 about the land. Then God says to Abraham, I am Hashem, who brought you out from Ur Kasdim, from that land far away, to assign this land to you as a possession. And I took you out of that land, and I'm giving you this land. And Abraham responds, he says, Lord Hashem, Adonai Elohim, Amida ki Rashena, how shall I know that I am going to possess this land? Now, I'm just going to take a step back and analyze Abraham's state of mind in this dialogue, right? Abraham is, I would say, skeptical, like doubtful that God is coming through with the promises that God has made, right? God has made, these are not new promises. God made these promises earlier in chapter 12. And Abraham is saying, Mati tenli, b'ma'eda, what can you give me? And by what shall I know? Okay? It's not that Abraham says, I trust you, I am full of faith, and I trust you 100%. So I know the promises that you made to me, years and years ago are still going to come true, even though I haven't seen any evidence of them yet. No, Abraham is saying, I'm afraid. I don't know when these promises are coming true, and I'm going to ask you about it. Okay? Now, what's striking about this scene in chapter 15 of Genesis is this is the very first time that Abraham ever says anything to God. The very first words that Abraham says to God are Mati tenli and b'ma'eda. What can you give me, and by what shall I know? And that's striking. You think about Abraham again, as Rabbi Cooper started us off with the Bar Torah about Abraham as the person who's prepared to sacrifice his only son. That's looking down the line in chapter 22. But right now, I would say Abraham is not embodying sort of perfect faith. Abraham is embodying a stance that we may be more familiar with from our own lives, which is skepticism, doubt, and wondering, And in that way, I think it's important, again, to bring it back to our Amida. Our Amida says, blessed are you, God, shield of Abraham. The shield as an image is something that, could have a variety of connotations. But if you look at it biblically, it only has this connotation. And what happens when God says, I am a shield for you? That's when Abraham feels secure enough, shielded enough to start giving voice to some of the doubts and questions that he has been carrying around for years and years. And in that way, I think that tefillot, that prayers, are not reserved for people who have perfect faith with no cracks and no wonderings, but in fact is intended for people who are about to ask God a whole bunch of questions. What can you give me, and by what shall I know? That sounds like a Jewish prayer to me, right? And it's in fact modeled by our ancestor Abraham, who is the first one to open his mouth to God and say, what can you give me? By what shall I know? So again, taking this into the experience of our own prayer, we might sort of offer a reading of our Amida in which, when I say, blessed are you, God, shield of Abraham, I am then reading the rest of that scene, about to stand in to my own questions, to my own doubts, to my own wonderings about God. And that's what prayer could be. It's an opportunity for those of us who are skeptics and doubtful to give voice to some of those questions directly to God. That's how I can use my prayer moment, my prayer time. And that's in fact something that's encouraged by God, who is standing in as our shield, who's protecting us and holding us and shielding us so that we feel safe enough to start asking those questions. Okay, and my hope is that we've been able to open up, at least to some extent, the lines of the liturgy to see how they function. They function as placeholders for scenes in the Bible that, when we think about those scenes in the context of our own prayers, might add another dimension what it means to stand before God, and to take it beyond a surface level understanding of God is great, mighty, and awesome, or God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and instead to explore the deeper meanings that hide behind these poetic lines of the Siddur. I'm going to pause here for just a few more minutes that we might have. I know we've been asking questions throughout, but any other final last licks that you want to get in terms of a question, I'm happy to take it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
Rabbi.
Yes.
David Starr here. How are you, Ellie?
Good to see you.
Likewise. So, you know, I love the way you ended, because it seems to me you're directly engaging the issue that I think a lot of us have, which is that we sort of get the fact that the book works better if you already have a relationship with God, and that therefore this dialogue is sort of flowing organically from a pre-existing relationship. The problem for a lot of people, of course, is when they feel the whole point is they don't necessarily know that they have that relationship. The question is, what role do the words then play in constructing a relationship as opposed to just expressing one that already exists?
Good. Yeah. So that I think is, and Rabbi Starr is a longtime teacher and rabbi of mine since college days. So it's, I'm honored to be here with you. I think you're raising a critical point, which is the Siddur might presuppose a relationship, maybe an attenuated relationship, maybe a difficult relationship, but a relationship nonetheless with the divine. And how am I supposed to relate to the words of the Siddur if I don't have that relationship? And I think that's sort of a core question. It's always amazing to me how many Jews still pray given that attenuated relationship. And I think that, you can actually read the Siddur. I've been thinking about putting an article like this together. Could you read the Siddur just purely as an atheist, and what would you get out of it, given the words that are already there, as opposed to a new Siddur that would be sort of constructed for people who don't have the relationship with God? And I think you can, in the ways in which, when God says, Hayel Gadol Gibor Vanara means, the great mighty and awesome God means, I take care of the widow, orphan, and stranger. So whether or not I have a relationship with God, I can ask myself, am I taking care of the widow, orphan, and stranger? Whether or not I have a relationship with God, I can ask myself, like Moshe might ask himself at the burning bush, am I doing my life's mission, or am I taking the easy way out and being a shepherd in Midian? So I think there's sort of like an ethical lens that you could add to these, or they could overlay for these words, that doesn't really depend on your relationship with God, and is just an opportunity for us to have a daily check-in, or multiple times a day check-in with, am I the person that I'm supposed to be? And I feel like that's something that most people haven't given. Some of us might have given up on even humans being able to be ethical, but let's say that we still believe in humans. That's an opportunity to take the Siddur and use it as my own ethical self-check, my own, am I acting in the world the way I'm supposed to be acting today? And that's sort of independent, if you need it to be, independent of my relationship with God. So I hope that's the beginning of an answer of how we might pray, even if we have this attenuated relationship with God. I just want to say to the members of the Shapiro family, it's an honor to be with you this morning, and to all of us who were able to spend this time together, I really appreciate it. It's nice to be able to spend some time on a computer studying, and really appreciate this community coming together to do that this morning. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Yesher Koach, Rabbi Kaunfer. I think we should give a big hand. And you've given us an enormous, rich amount to learn and study and so on. Just thank you so much. And now I turn it over for closing remarks to Ruth Shapiro.
It's difficult to follow presentations as rich as the one that we just listened to. and is tantalizing and challenging. I know that it's one that my husband would have enjoyed listening to, adding to, and would be pleased that so many of us are here today in a time when so much is being challenged, that some ideas and some beliefs stand firm. So I thank you, Rabbi Kaunfer, for raising these questions, for challenging us once more to appreciate the traditions that we have and how we must continue to address it and continue it. I want to also thank everybody in the not only in my family, but in the Oheb Shalom family for coming again, the family that my husband loved and worked with so many years and that I still am a member of. And of course, I want to thank Rabbi Cooper and especially not Rabbi, but Jeremy, who did so much work in bringing this about. And I want to thank Betty. I hope she's here today. I hope she's well enough to be here today for her continuing support of these ideas and this program. I suppose it's a good time to wish us all well and to be grateful that the other tradition that we honor, the tradition of America, seems to be in good shape for the moment at least and continuing. And I look forward to seeing you and speaking to all of you again, perhaps in a more immediate form than the one that Zoom has given us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And normally there would be a member of the Shapiro family leading us in the Birkat Hamazon, but since we are not eating, I think that concludes our program. Unless Rabbi Cooper, do you have a final concluding remark, or is that it?